Okay, hello, and welcome. I'd like to welcome you to the third Michael Henry Heim Memorial Lecture on Translation and Translation Studies, and to thank everyone for coming. This lecture is intended to honor the legacy of Michael Heim at UCLA and to the humanities in the nation and beyond. I think we have a nice program for you. We're very fortunate that the distinguished novelist Dubravka Ugresic accepted our invitation to deliver the lecture this year. We invited her because of her many contributions to literature as a novelist and an essayist, and also because Michael Heim loved her work, championed it, and translated several of her books. We're also fortunate that Sina Ramani, a brilliant young scholar who worked closely with Mike Heim, will join us to make some brief remarks about him as a mentor. And I'm also delighted that Laure Murat, professor of French and director of the European and Russian Studies, will be presenting our distinguished speaker. I'm also delighted that Priscilla Heim is honoring all of us with her presence for this event. She was the most important person in Mike's life, and her support was essential to many of his finest accomplishments. Translation and translation studies are mainstays in the humanities and in comparative literary studies, but this was not always the case. 40 years ago, Michael Heim was a lone voice in the desert when he argued that the study and practice of translation at the university deserves the same consideration as any other contribution by a scholar. He was eloquent in making the point that the amount of knowledge and experience required to produce a translation could often surpass the amount of knowledge and experience required to produce other kinds of scholarship. He also knew that the study of translation and the translation process could have wide-ranging implications to our understanding of literature and culture that can go well beyond the transmission of culture or the communication between cultures, which are already worthy endeavors. Today, it is no longer necessary to argue that translation matters, and Michael Heim played a significant role in this change through his work as one of the world's leading translators, through his publications on translation, through his teaching, and through his generosity to translators and scholars locally, but throughout the world as well. He was always ready and available to offer guidance and advice to young scholars and translators. And as a collective project with Priscilla, he quietly established a major grant for translators, which the Heims founded anonymously through the Pen Club. The number of significant academic programs, courses, and publications in this area have been growing considerably, and incidentally, posthumous articles by Michael Heim continue to appear, including one of the major pieces in the Blackwell Companion to Translation Studies, which appeared a few months ago. And since the last memorial lecture, his translation from the Romanian of Max Belcher's Adventures in Immediate Reality, published by New Directions, has appeared in print. I'd like to add that a translator's dictionary in which he collaborated with several Chinese scholars who came to UCLA to work under his guidance is another one of his projects that is still to be published. 3 weeks before his passing, Mike called me on the telephone to let me know that he was keen on teaching his translation seminar not only once, as was his custom, but twice in the same academic year. He realized that there was already an overflow of students signed up for the fall term, and he knew that his illness would make it necessary for him to retire soon. So he wanted to make sure that he could teach the course to all the students who wanted to take it. He said to me that it was more important for him to share his knowledge with interested students in this course than to finish all of the essays and translations he had underway. The origin of this memorial lecture came from a conversation I had with several UCLA graduate students, including Sina Rahmani, who will speak to us in a couple of minutes, about meaningful ways to remember Mike and to honor his legacy to our university. In the conversation, we thought that a lecture addressing topics that would have been dear to him was the most obvious way to start, and given his generosity in creating a major grant for translators, another way to recognize his legacy would be a graduate fellowship for a UCLA graduate student in any department who is a translator or who works in translation studies. So we're making some progress in our goal to make this lecture a self-funded endeavor, and we have received some generous donations for which we are grateful. Our Dean of Humanities funded the first 2 lectures, and we are grateful for his support. This year, the memorial lecture is a joint effort of UCLA's Department of Comparative Literature and the Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Languages and Cultures, which Michael Heim once chaired, and he also loved being a member of that department as well. I'd like to acknowledge the support of Professor Ronald Brun, the current chair of Slavic, for his generous support of this lecture as well. I'm also very grateful for the co-sponsorship of this event by UCLA's Center for European and Russian Studies. I'd like to thank its former director, Gail Kligman, for recommending that we invite Dubravka Ugresic to deliver this year's lecture, and to its current director, Laure Murat, for her willingness to make the introductions. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation to Olivia Diaz, our MSO, Jessica Herrera, Complit's SAO, and other staff members for their wonderful goodwill and hard work with all the practicalities. I would also like to express my gratitude to Sarah Murphy, who works in the Division of Humanities, for her support of this endeavor. So now I'd like to say a couple of words introducing Sina Rahmani. Sina is currently Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta. He is also a visiting assistant professor in the Department of English at Claremont Graduate University. He completed his PhD dissertation in 2014 at UCLA's Department of Comparative Literature, focusing on the question of British orphanhood. His work, including translations, has been published in or forthcoming in the PMLA, Boundary 2, Iranian Studies, Public Book, and the Radical History Review. So I'd like to welcome Sina and have him make an evocation of Mike.
Hi. At the beginning of the final interview he granted before his death, Jacques Derrida, the Franco-Algerian Sephardic philosopher, critic, scholar, activist, and, might I add, consummate badass, was asked about the first, somewhat mystifying opening line of Spectres of Marx, a controversial book he had penned 10 years earlier. The book opens by quoting an audience member who had approached Derrida after one of his lectures and announced to the philosopher, quote, "I would like to learn to live, finally." Reflecting on this phrase, Derrida responds, characteristically, by way of a roundabout elaboration on the meaning of the phrase, finally knowing how to live. He says, "It plays, albeit seriously, with the common meaning of the phrase. To learn to live is to mature and educate too. To tell someone, 'I'll teach you how to live,' means, sometimes with an undertone of menace, 'I'm going to shape you. I'm going to put you right.' Also, the equivocation of this play means even more to me. This sigh is also an opening to another line of questioning. To live, can that be learned, taught? Can one learn by method or training, by experience or experiment, to accept, better yet, to affirm life?" This worry over heritage and death resonates throughout Spectres of Marx. It is also the torment of parents and their children. When will you become responsible? When will you be accountable for your life and name? This concluding line, and indeed this entire passage, seems to me the best way to articulate how I respond to, how I account for the giant who walked these halls, Michael Henry Heim. My most fond memory of him, in fact, seems to suggest as much, insofar as it involves the response to a name. Having arrived to my community garden in Hollywood with Priscilla one glorious Sunday afternoon in October 2011, Mike pointed to a flower in my plot and asked me its name. A gazania, I said. And without a pause, Mike fired back, somewhat skeptically, gazania? That sounds like a made-up word. I don't really remember what I said to him in that response, but I do remember the feeling of amazement that befell me when a few weeks later I looked up the etymology. Where does this word come from? It comes from a translator. Botanists trace the term back to Theodore Gaza, who was a 15th century humanist known for his translations of Aristotle, particularly his writing on plants. The words of mourning composed by one of his contemporaries are really useful here, I think. Not long ago, Your Holiness, we suffered a great and incomparable loss in the person of Theodore Gaza. That Greek man outdid all Latins in the task of writing and translating. If he had lived longer, he would have enriched the Latin language in this field as well. He did that indeed in those most perfect books of Aristotle's on animals and Theophrastus's on plants. In my view, he is the only one to challenge antiquity itself. I have set myself to honor and imitate this man. And even though I don't really want to suggest that any person's life, especially a person like Michael Heim, can be essentialized in a single anecdote, for me, that moment of invisible genius one Sunday afternoon in Hollywood contains so many facets of a great, wonderful man who stands as a true intellectual giant of our era and many more to come. I use that word giant here not simply because of the impossibly long list of accomplishments that I could barely even begin to account for in the time provided here. Rather, it was the grandeur of spirit in which he conducted himself as a mentor and as a teacher. At the risk of making this about me, let me use my own brief but life-changing time with him to illustrate. Having returned to Los Angeles after almost 2 years abroad in Germany and France, I emailed Mike to ask if he would be willing to supervise an independent study focused on my first real translation project, something, by the way, he did for countless students. Now, for the uninitiated, an independent studies is in addition to the regular teaching burdens placed upon professors. They don't get really any credit for it, but he did it just to help. As a secular person, it's hard for me to admit this, but it must have been the work of some deity that I, who had never really studied translation in any serious way, would be lucky enough to have the privilege of spending the next 6 months meeting once a week for 2 hours sometimes to discuss my piddly little assignment with one of the 20th century's most accomplished minds in literary translation. Sitting beside him in his office, which, as some of you may know, was as chaotic as my prose, he painstakingly pruned, nipped, and tucked my many awkward attempts to render a dense and extremely boring German philosophical essay. He would punctuate these lessons, thank God, with the most hilariously amusing asides. Like once he paused to tell me a long story about the conversion provoked by the German word sogenannte during a trip to East Berlin in the 1970s. Like a peasant, I would bring fruits and vegetables from my garden with me to our meetings, eager to express my deep appreciation for his increasingly precious time that he was so generously sharing with me. Always the giver, Mike. He would surprise me with an email every now and then, informing me that he had left a jar of preserves in my mailbox. Reflecting now, I realize another reason why the Derrida passage helps me come to terms with what Mike Heim did for our world. It is a painful and hilarious reminder of why all the schoolboyish zeal for machine translations espoused in so many corners of the humanities and beyond is so patently dumb. Let's return to the passage for a second. Almost every second sentence, which, by the way, this is a passage about a wordplay, has itself its own wordplay, and that requires careful and discerning attention. The verb mûrir, for instance, also means to ripen, and inscribed in te former is one of the oldest dilemmas in philosophy, namely the problem of idealist forms and their translations into material reality. Even more troubling are the multiple significations of dresser, which can mean to lift, to prop up, to set up like a table, to break in, and to tame. So for all the millions of dollars in their arsenal, the tens of thousands of highly educated minds at work, and our collective belief in the messianic power of Silicon Valley, Google Translate strikes out badly when you give it one sentence, one paragraph from one interview by one philosopher. On first glance, a decent try from the folks in Mountain View. But look closer. The embarrassing inability to differentiate between direct and indirect objects, the ham-fisted literal rendering of pivotal verbs, and the total lack of comprehension of even a slightly unconventional syntax. This is what Google can do for us. But Mike Heim's legacy, a tricky concept for our instantaneous and disposable society, I think is best encapsulated not by the hilarious impotence of machine translation, but rather his own words and the insistence underlying the plea that concludes a short text he co-authored for the American Council of Learned Societies. The growing hegemony, he writes, of a single language has had several deleterious effects. First, authors writing in a second language, no matter how well they have learned it, are less likely to express their ideas with precision and sophisticated nuance than authors writing in their own language. Secondly, the lack of a thriving social science literature in a given natural language undercuts the basis for communication about disciplinary issues in that linguistic community. Thirdly, and this is really important, I think, for all of us, the forms of thought and argumentation in the Anglo-American social science community have become a Procrustean bed to whose dimensions all conceptualizations must fit. The result is an increasing homogenization and impoverishment of social science discourse. Now, I don't need to say that this warning against increasing homogenization and impoverishment is as urgent to those of us in humanities as it is in the social scientists. By dedicating his life to the task of translation, Mike, armed with only a few dictionaries and working in a simple two-story house, reminded us that the world is not as dumb and simple-minded as those in Silicon Valley would have us believe. That the matrices and algorithms cannot account for the infinite permutations of language. That literature, he reminds us ultimately, is a fundamentally anarchist practice that brooks no gods and accepts no masters. As much as we'd like to think that it could, the rise of the digital is not going to solve our species' most persistent dilemma, the ability or inability to listen to other voices. Like rhizomes under the ground, languages spread and grow in mysterious, unpredictable, and marvelous ways. They burst forth and bloom, and it falls to us to patiently and carefully harvest their seeds and take them to new places, sometimes replicating them and sometimes splicing them together with others. Mike Heim, like Theodorus of Gaza and Jacques Derrida, carved out new terrains and challenged our world to keep thinking about how we respond to our lives and our names. He challenged us to think about learning how to live finally. And it was my honor to have not only known the man, but to have had the privilege of digging alongside him. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sina. And now I'd like to introduce Laure Murat, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. And Laure, of course, is one of the jewels in the humanities at UCLA. She's an impressive scholar, a wonderful essayist, and she has generously enriched the lives of our community by hosting these wonderful public events that engage the intersections between literature, music, and the visual arts. She is director of the Center for European Russian Studies at UCLA, professor in the Department of French and Francophone Studies, specializing in cultural history, gender studies, intellectual history of the 19th and 20th centuries, especially the history of psychiatry. She is author of numerous books, including La Maison du Docteur Blanche, which won the prestigious Goncourt Prize in France, and also the Critics' Prize of the Académie Française, Passage de l'Odéon, La Loi du Genre, L'homme qui se prenait pour Napoléon, which all these books have won prizes. And the last one, L'homme qui se prenait pour Napoléon, has just been translated into English as The Man Who Thought He Was Napoleon at Chicago University Press. This year, she's published Relire and Flaubert à la mode piquée. Among its many merits, the last book is helping to transform and shape the perception of Los Angeles in the French-speaking world. So it is with gratitude that I pass the word to Laure to present our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much, Efrain. On Dubravka Ugrešic's website, there is a rubric, as in almost any website, called Home. Don't worry, I won't elaborate on what is home for the author of a collection of essays entitled Nobody's Home, where it is stated, I quote, The only way exiles are able to leave trauma behind is to not leave it behind at all, but to live it as a permanent state, to turn their waiting room into a cheery ideology of life, to live the schizophrenia of exile as the norm of normalcy, and to revere only one God, the suitcase. So instead of speculating about home, I prefer to give you, as an appropriate introduction to Dubravka Ugresic work and personality, a glimpse of the three excerpts that are quoted on her home page, the page being possibly the only acceptable home. The first excerpt interrogates the possible disappearance of literature with capital L in the future, replaced by fragments scattered on websites read by cyberspace travelers as if they look at hieroglyphs. The second excerpt asks about what makes a good book. The answer was provided by one of Dubravka Ugresic's students: it should sparkle. The writer adds, I quote, "Whenever I finish writing a book, I lean my ear to the manuscript and listen in panic. Is it bubbly or still? Does it pulsate or is it flat? Warm or cool? A sparkler or a charred, sputtering little stick?" The third excerpt questions identification and conjures up Toto, Dorothy's dog in The Wizard of Oz, who tugs back the curtain, exposing the great wizard for what he is, a charlatan. As a conclusion, Dubravka Ugresic asks, quoting one of her favorite authors and a recurring reference in her work, I quote, "Gustave Flaubert announced, 'I am Madame Bovary,' and I, what can I say?" It is my task now to deliver what can only be, I'm afraid, a very official version of who you are. As the three excerpts demonstrated, and according to her own words, Dubravka Ugresic, who lives in Amsterdam, is a citizen of literature, still with a capital L. Over the past 3 decades, she has established herself as one of Europe's most distinctive novelists and essayists. Following degrees in comparative and Russian literature, Ugresic worked for many years at the University of Zagreb's Institute for Theory of Literature, successfully pursuing parallel careers as both a writer and a scholar. In 1991, when war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, Ugresic took a firm anti-war stance, critically dissecting Croatian and Serbian nationalism, the stupidity and criminality of war. Subjected to prolonged public ostracism and persistent media harassment, she left Croatia in 1993. In an exile that has in time become immigration, her books have been translated into over 20 languages. She has taught at a number of American and European universities, Harvard, UCLA, and the Free University of Berlin among them. She's the winner of several major literary prizes, the NIN prizes, Austrian State Prize for European Literature in 1998. She was a finalist of Man Booker International Prize in 2009. Most recently, the 2012 Jean Améry Essay Prize, awarded for her essayistic work as a whole. Karaoke Culture in 2011 was a finalist for the National Book Critics Critical Circle Award for criticism. Her newest collection of essays is Europe in Sepia, and it has come out in 2014. The title of her talk today is Transnational versus National Literature. Please join me in welcoming Dubravka Ugresic.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for public opportunity to say once again how much I loved and liked Michael Heim, and how wonderful educator and translator and the person he was. I write in the language of a small country. I left that small country 20 years ago in an effort to preserve my right to a literary voice, to defend my writings from the constraints of political, national, ethnic, gender, and other ideological projections. Although true, the explanation rings phony, like a line from an intellectual soap opera. Male literary history, is there any other? Is full of such lines. But when with men being geniuses, rebels, visionaries, intellectual and moral bastions, when it comes to intellectual autobiographical kitsch, they get free passes. People only turn up their noses when it escapes a woman's lip. Even hip memes like Words Without Borders and Literature Without Borders ring pretty phony too. The important point here is that having crossed the border, I found myself in a literary out-of-nation zone, the implication of which I only figured out much later. It could be said that I didn't actually leave my country, but rather that splitting into 6 smaller ones, my country, Yugoslavia, left me. My mother tongue was the only baggage I took with me, the only souvenir my country bequeathed me. My spoken language in everyday situations was easy to switch, but changing my literary language, I was too old for that. However, I don't have any romantic illusions about the now it comes the word I can't pronounce, irreplaceability of one's mother tongue, nor have I ever understood the coinage's etymology. Perhaps this is because my mother was Bulgarian, and Bulgarian her mother tongue. She spoke flawless Croatian, though, better than many Croats. On the off chance I did ever have any romantic yearnings, they were destroyed irrevocably almost 2 decades ago, when Croatian libraries were euphorically purged of non-Croatian books, meaning books by Serbian writers printed in Cyrillic letters, Croatian traitors, books by commies and Yugoslavs, and so on. Mouths buttoned tight, my fellow writers bore witness to a practice that may have been short-lived, but was no less terrifying for it. Indeed, if I ever harbored any linguistic romanticism, it was destroyed forever the day Bosnian Serbs set their mortars on the National Library in Sarajevo. Radovan Karadžić, a Sarajevo psychiatrist and poet, a colleague, led the mission of destruction. Today, equally stubbornly and stupidly, people from Vukovar destroy plaques with the names of the streets in both Cyrillic and Latin letters. Cyrillic letters, they say, hurt their feelings. When it comes from Muslim perpetrators, cultural vandalism is usually followed with rich media attention. When it comes from any corner of Europe, it is followed by silence. Writers at least ought not to forget these things. I haven't, which is why I repeat them obsessively. For the majority of writers, a mother tongue and national literature are natural homes. For an unjusted minority, they're zones of trauma. For such writers, the translation of their work into foreign languages is a kind of a refugee shelter. And so translation is for me. In the euphoria of the Croatian bibliocide, my books also ended up on the scrap heap. After several years of academic and literary wandering, I set up camp in a small and convivial European country. Both my former and my present literary milieu consider me a foreigner, each for their own reasons, of course, and they're not far wrong. I am a foreigner, and I have my reasons. The ON zone, not UN, but ON, out of nation zone, is an unusual place to voluntarily live one's literary life. Life in the zone is pretty lonely, yet with the suspect joy of a failed suicide, I live with the consequences of a choice that was my own. I write in a language that has split into 3 or 4, Croatian, Serbian, and Bosnian, but in spite of the efforts to will it apart, remains the same language. It's the language in which war criminals have pled their innocence in the Hague Tribunal for the past 20 years. At some point, the tribunal's tortured translators came up with an appropriate acronym, BCS, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. Understandably, the peoples reduced and retarded by their bloody divorce can't stand the fact that their language is now just an acronym. So the Croats call it Croatian, the Bosnians Bosnian, the Serbs Serbian. Even the Montenegrins have come up with an original name. They call it Montenegrin. What sane person would want a literary marriage with an evidently traumatized literary personality like me? No one. Maybe the odd translator. Translators keep me alive in literary life. Our marriage is a match between two paupers. Our symbolic capital on the stock market of world literature, entirely negligible. My admiration for translators is immense, even when they translate the names Ilf and Petrov as the name of Siberian city. Translators are mostly humble folk, almost invisible on the literary map. They live quiet life in the author's shadow. My empathy with translators stems, at least in part, from my own position on the literary map. I often feel like I'm invisible too. However, things really are translating, even from a small language, is still considered a profession. But writing in a small language from a literary out-of-nation zone, now, that is not a profession. That is a diagnosis. The platitude about literature knowing no borders isn't one to be believed. Only literatures written in major languages enjoy passport-free travel. Writerly representatives of major literatures travel without papers. A major literature, their invisible later de noblesse. Writers in strange and self-estranged, exiled or self-exiled from their maternal literatures, they tend to travel on dubious passports. A literary custom officers can, at any time, escort them from the literary train under absolutely any pretext. The estranged or self-estranged writer is such a rare species, she's barely worth mentioning. All this help explain my eternal neurosis. As an ON writer, I always feel obliged to explain my complicated literary passport to an imagined customs officer. And as is always the case, when you get into a conversation with a customs officer on an unequal footing, ironic multiplications of misunderstandings soon follow. What does it matter, you might say, whether someone is a Croatian, Belgian, or American writer? Literature knows no borders, you retort. But it does matter. The difference lies in the reception of the author's position. It's in the way an imagined custom officer flicks through one's passport. And although it would never cross our minds to self-designate so, we readers, we are those customs officers. Every text is inseparable from its author and vice versa. It's just that different authors get different treatment. The difference is whether a text travels together with a male or female author, whether the author belongs to a major or minor literature, writes in a major or minor language, whether a text accompanies a famous or anonymous author, whether the author is young or old, Mongolian or English, Surinamese or Italian, an Arab woman or an American man, a homosexual or heterosexual. All of these things alter the meaning of the text, help or hinder its circulation. Let's imagine for a moment that someone sends me and my fellow writer, let's call him Dexter, to the North Pole, to each write an essay about our trip. Let's also imagine a coincidence. Dexter and I returned from our trip with exactly the same text. Dexter's position doesn't require translation. It's universal one. Dexter is a representative of Anglo-American letters, the dominant literature of our time. My position will be translated as Balkan, post-Yugoslav, Croatian, and of course, female. All told, a particular and specific one. My description of the white desert will be quickly imbued with projected content. Customs officers will ask Dexter whether in the white expanse he encountered the metaphysical. Astounded that I don't live at home, they'll ask me why I live in Amsterdam, how it is that I, of all people, got sent to the North Pole. And while they're at it, they'll inquire how, even I am annoyed with this microphone, so how it is with you. So they will ask how I got sent to the North Pole, and how do I feel about the development of Croatian ecofeminism. Not bothering to read his work first, they'll maintain that Dexter is a great writer, and me, not bothering to read my work first either, they'll declare a kind of literary tourist guide to the Balkan region, of course, where else? To be fair, how my text about North Pole will be received in my former literary community is also a question worth asking. As my encounter with the metaphysical? God, no. Croats will ask me how the Croatian diaspora is getting on up there. How I, Croatian woman, managed to cope in the frozen north, and whether I plunged a Croatian flag into the ice. Actually, in all likelihood, my text won't even be published. With appropriate fanfare, they will publish Dexter's. It will be called How a Great American Writer Warmed Us to the North Pole. That literature knows no borders is just a platitude, but it's one we need to believe in. Both originals and their translations exist in literature. The life of a translation is inseparable from the relatively stable life of its original. Yet, the life of a translation is often much more interesting and dramatic. Translations, poor, good, mangled, congenial, live rich lives. A reader's energy is interwoven into this life. In it are the mass of books that expand, enlighten, and entertain us, that save our lives. The books whose pages are imbued with our own experiences, our life's convictions, the times in which we live, all kinds of things. Many things can be deducted from a translation. And let us not forget, readers are also translators. The Wizard of Oz, for example, was my favorite children's book. Much later, I found out that the book had traveled from the Russia to Yugoslavia and the rest of the East European world, and that it wasn't written by a certain A. Volkov, who happened to adapt it, but by the American writer Frank L. Baum. The first time I went to Moscow, way back in 1975, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had turned up in a monochrome Oz, and that I, like Toto, just needed pulled to the curtain to reveal a decide masked by the special effects of totalitarianism. Baum's innocent arrow pierced the heart of totalitarian regime in a way that arrows of Soviet dissident literature never could. Every translation is a miracle of communication, a game of Chinese whispers, where the word at the start of the chain is inseparable from the exiting the mouth of whomever is at the end. Every translation is not only a multiplication of misunderstandings, but also a multiplication of meanings. Our lungs full, we need to give wind to the journey of text, to keep watch out for the eccentrics who send messages in bottles, and the equally eccentric who search for bottles, carrying messages. We need to participate in the orgy of communication, even when it seems to those of us sending messages that communication is buried by din and thus senseless, because somewhere on a distant shore a recipient awaits our message. To paraphrase Borges, he or she exists to misunderstand it and transform it into something else. Data from the International Organization for Migration changes from hour to hour, so there is no point of bringing it here. Migrants make around 220 million people, maybe more. Within that figure, there is a certain number in millions of displaced people and certain number of refugees. Women make up 49% of the migrant population. It's a fair assumption that in this imagined migrant state, there would be at least a negligible percentage of writers, half of whom would be women. Writers who have either chosen to live in the ON zone or been forced to seek its shelter need more oxygen than that provided by translations into foreign languages alone. For a full-blooded literary life, such writers need an imaginary library, a context in which their work might be located, because more often than not, such work floats free in a kind of limbo. The construction of a context, of a literary and theoretical platform, a theoretical raft that might accommodate the dislocated and deterritorialized, the transnational and a-national, cross-cultural and transcultural writers, cosmopolitans, neo-nomads, and literary vagabonds, those who write in adopted languages, in newly acquired languages, in multiple languages, in mother tongues, in non-maternal habitats, all those who have voluntarily undergone the process of dispatriation. Much work on a construction of such a context remains. In writing outside the nation some 10 years ago, Azadeh Sehan attempted to construct a theoretical framework for interpreting literary works written in exile, mostly those of Turkish diaspora in Germany. Works condemned to invisibility within both the cultural context of a writer's host country and that of his or her abandoned homeland. This theoretical framework was transnational literature. In the intervening years, several new books have appeared, and the literary practice of transnational literature has become increasingly rich and diverse. There are ever more younger authors writing in the languages of their host countries. Some emigrated with their parents and speak their mother tongue barely, or not at all. Others, for cultural and pragmatic or literary and aesthetic reasons, have consciously exchanged their mother tongues for the language of their hosts. Some write in the language of their host countries while retaining the mental blueprint of their mother tongue, giving rise to surprising linguistic melanges. Others create defamiliarizing effects by mixing the vocabulary of two or sometimes multiple languages. Changes are taking place not only within individual texts, but also in their reception. Although I still write in the same language, I can't seem to follow contemporary Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian literature with the ease I once did. I get hung up on things local readers wouldn't bat an eyelid at. I sense the undertones and nuances differently to how they do, and it makes me wonder about the chemical reaction that takes place inside the recipient of a text, in this case me. When cultural habitat, language, and addressee have all changed, my relationship towards the canonic literary values of the region has also changed. Texts I once embraced wholeheartedly now seem laughably weak. My own literary modus changed in the very moment I was once invited to write a column for a Dutch newspaper. That was in 1992. I was temporarily in America. War raged in my homeland, and the addressee of my columns were Dutch readers. I don't know whether it is harder to articulate ON zone or to live in it. Cultural mediators rarely take into account contemporary cultural practice in which, at least in Europe, direct producers collocate with a sizable cultural bureaucracy, from national institutions and ministries of culture to European cultural institutions and cultural managers, to the manifold NGOs active in the sector. The cultural bureaucracy is primarily engaged in the protection and promotion of national cultures, in enabling cultural exchange. The bureaucracy writes and adheres to policy that suits its own ends, creating its own cultural platform, and rarely seeking the opinion of producers. Let's be frank with each other. In the cultural food chain, producers have become completely irrelevant. What's important is that cultural stuff happens, and that is managed. Publishers are important, not writers. Galleries and curators are important, not artists. Literary festivals are important, not the writers who participate. Almost every European host country treats its transnational writers the same way it treats its immigrants. The civilized European milieu built its immigrants' residential neighborhoods, here and there making an effort to adapt to urban architecture to the hypothetical tastes of future residents. Discrete orientalization a favorite. Many stand in line to offer a warm welcome. Designers such as Dutch Cindy van den Bremen, for example, design their new Muslim countrywomen modern hijabs so that they've got something to wear when they play soccer, tennis, or take a dip at the pool. The hosts do all kinds of things that they've ever so proud of, it never occurring to them that maybe they do so not to pull emigrants out of the ghetto, but rather to subtly keep them there, in the ghetto of their identities and cultures, whatever either might mean to them. To draw an invisible line between us and them, and thus render many social spheres inaccessible. It is for this very same reason that the publishing industry loves exotic authors so long as supply and demand are balanced. Many such authors fall over themselves to ingratiate themselves with publishers. What else can they do? And anyway, why wouldn't they? Does transnational literature have its readers? And if it does, who they are? Publishers have long since pondered to the hypothetical tastes of the majority of customers, and the majority's tastes will inevitably reject many books as being culturally incomprehensible. If the trend of cultural comprehensibility, the standardization of the literary taste, continues, and there is no reason why it won't, then every conversation about transnational literature is but idle chatter about the literary utopia. And anyway, how do we establish what is authentic and what a product of market compromise? Our literary tastes, the tastes of literary consumers, have in time also become standardized, self-adjusting to the products offered by the culture industry. Let's not forget, the mass culture industry takes great care in rearing its consumers. In this respect, transculturality has also been transformed into a commercial trump card. In and of itself, the term bears a positive inflections, but its incorporation in a literary work needn't be any guarantee of literary quality, which is how it is increasingly deployed in the literary marketplace. today the marketplace offers a rich vein of such books, almost all well regarded and their authors protected by the voguish theoretical terms: hybridity, transnationality, transculturality, cross-culturality, ethnic and gender identities, and so on and so forth. Here, literary kitsch is shaded by a smoke screen of ostensible political correctness, heady cocktails mixing East and West, Amsterdam Sufis and American housewives, Saharan Bedouins and Austrian feminists, the burqa and Prada, the turban and Armani. And where are my readers? Who is going to support me and my little homespun enterprise in the neoliberal system of which literature is certainly part and parcel? My shop is doomed to close. And what happens then with my right to defend my texts from the constraints of political, national, ethnic, and other ideological projections? My freedom has been eaten by democracy. That's not actually a bad way to put it. There are, in any case, any number of parks in which I can offer speeches to the birds. What is the quality of a freedom where newspapers are slowly disappearing because they're not able, so the claim goes, to make a profit? When departments for many literatures are closing because there aren't any students, when publishers unceremoniously dump their unprofitable writers, irrespective of whether those writers have won major international awards, when Greeks are having to flog the family silver, one of Apollo's temples in Athens is rumored to be going under the hammer, when the Dutch are fine about closing one of the oldest departments for astrophysics in the world, in Utrecht, because it turns out that studying the sun is unprofitable. Things are just a whisker better for you because, like it or not, at least you've got a kind of marketing angle. But me, I'm completely invisible, even within my own national literature. A Dutch writer, friend of mine, Kvetches. And I mumble to myself, Christ, my brand really is a goodie. Being a Croatian writer who lives in Amsterdam is just the sexiest thing ever. But I understand what my Amsterdam acquaintance is going on about. And really, how does one decide between two professional humiliations, between humiliating invisibility in one's own country, literary milieu, and humiliating visibility in a foreign one? The latter visibility inevitably based on details such as the incongruence between one's place of birth and one's place of residence, the color of one's skin, or an abandoned homeland that has just suffered a coup d'etat. My Dutch acquaintance isn't far from the truth. Within the context of contemporary Dutch literature, or any other literature, where there is no longer any context, where there is no longer literature, where it is no longer of any importance whatsoever whether anyone reads a book as so long as they're buying them, where it is no longer of any importance whatsoever what people read as long as they're reading, where the author is forced into the role of a salesperson, promoter, and interpreter of his or her own work. Only in such a deeply anti-literary and anti-intellectual context I'm forced to feel lucky to be noticed as a Croatian writer who lives in Amsterdam. And what's more, to be envied for it. By now, it should be obvious that little pothole I overlooked when I abandoned my national literature is a sinkhole of the market. Times have certainly changed since I exited the national zone and entered end zone. What was then a gesture of resistance is today barely understood by anyone. Of course, not all changes are immediately apparent. The cultural landscape remains the same. We are still surrounded by things that were once and are still evidence of our raison d'être. We are still surrounded by bookshops, although in recent years we have noticed that the selection of books has petrified, that the same books by the same authors stand displayed in the same spots for years on end, as if bookshops are but a front, camouflage for a parallel purpose. The officer in charge has done everything he should have, just forgotten to periodically swap the selection of books, make things look convincing. Libraries are still around too, although there are less of them, some shut with the tears and a wail, others with a slam. Literary theorists, critics, and professoriate, readers, they're all still here. Sure, there aren't many of them, but still enough to make being a writer somewhat sensical. Publishers, editors, agents, they're still in the room, though more and more often it occurs to us that they're not the same people anymore. If it's as if no one really knows whether they are dead or if it is us who are dead. Just no one's gotten around to telling us. We have missed the boat on heaps of stuff. It's like we have turned up at a party, invitation, safely in hand, but for some reason it's the dress code all wrong. Literary life in the Owen zone seems to have lost any real sense. The ethical imperatives that once drove writers, intellectuals, and artists to dispatriation have, in the meantime, lost their value in the marketplace of ideas. The most frequent reasons for artistic and intellectual protest, fascism, nationalism, xenophobia, religious fundamentalism, political dictatorship, human rights violations, and the like, have been perverted by the voraciousness of the market, stripped of any ideological impetus and imbued with marketing clout, pathologizing even the most untamed struggle for freedom and transforming it into a struggle for commercial prestige. For this reason, it's completely irrelevant whether tomorrow I leave my own zone and return home, whether I set up shop somewhere else, or whether I stay where I am. For the first time, I can see that my zone is just a wretched tent erected between the giant tower blocks of a new corporate culture. Although my books and the recognition they have received serve to confirm my professional status, they offer me no protection from the feeling that I've lost my profession, not to mention my right to a profession. I'm not alone. There are many like me. Many of us, without having noticed, have become homeless. For a quick buck, others, more powerful, have set their wrecking ball on our house. After abandoning or being expelled from a couple of literary houses, multicultural one, Yugoslav one, which had been brutally destroyed, I unwillingly found myself under the roof and rules of Croatian National one. As a writer, I could not accept a house where literary values are based on the national roots, blood, types of literary tenants, and fabricated literary tradition, always male naturally. After I tried a literary house called Exile, where I had been treated as a Croatian writer living in exile, I'm looking forward to move one day into a new global literary house that had been constructed bit by bit by us, practitioners, by literary scholars, educators and translators like Michael Heim, students, young people who migrate, write in 2 or 3 languages, who pick their cultural references from the whole world, adopt freely different cultures, and live them with passion and understanding. Thank you.